Let's talk about dopamine. Most people have heard of dopamine, and we hear all the time about dopamine hits. But actually, there's no such thing as a dopamine hit. And actually, the way that your body uses dopamine is to have a baseline level of dopamine, meaning an amount of dopamine circulating in your brain and body all the time. And this turns out to be important on how you feel generally, whether or not you're in a good mood, motivated, etc. And you can also experience peaks in dopamine above baseline. A simple way to envision dopamine hits is every time you do something you like, such as eating a piece of chocolate, and you feel dopamine through your taste buds. You look at your Instagram and you feel dopamine from scrolling. You see someone you like, and you feel dopamine with butterflies in your stomach. All these things described as dopamine hits neglect the fact that if you scroll social media and you see something you really like, dopamine hit. Sure, there's an increase in dopamine, but then you get to something else and you go, not that interesting. However, had you arrived at that second thing first, you might think that it was really interesting. If you had arrived at that second Instagram post, 3 days later or 4 days later, you might find it extremely interesting. Again, how much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there, and your previous dopamine peaks. That's super important to understand. And it's completely neglected by the general language of dopamine hits. This is why when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for this enjoyment goes up and up and up. So I want to talk about that process. And I want to explain how that process works, because if you understand that process, and you understand some of this schedule and kinetics and we call dopamine, you will be in a terrific position to use any dopamine-enhancing tools that you decide to use. You'll be in an excellent position to modulate and control your own dopamine release for optimal motivation and drive. So what sorts of activities, what sorts of things increase dopamine? And how much do they increase dopamine? Well, let's take a look at some typical things that people do out there to increase dopamine. So let's recall you have a baseline level of dopamine, and that everyone does. Your level of dopamine has everything to do with those genetics, but also with what you've experienced in the previous days and previous months and so on. When you do ingest certain things, your levels of dopamine will rise above baseline transiently, and depending on what you do or ingest, it will rise either more or less, and it will be very brief or last a long time. So let's look at some of the typical things people take and do and eat. Some are good for us, some are not good for us. And let's ask how much dopamine is increased above baseline. Chocolate. They didn't look at milk versus dark chocolate. But chocolate will increase your base level of dopamine by 1.5 times. So it's a pretty substantial increase in dopamine. It's transient, it goes away after a few minutes or even a few seconds. I'll explain what determines the duration in a minute, but 1.5 times for chocolate. Sex. Both the pursuit of sex and the act of sex increase dopamine 2 times. So it's a doubling above baseline. Now, of course, there's going to be a variation there, but that's the average increase in baseline dopamine caused by sex. Nicotine, in particular nicotine that is smoked like cigarettes and so forth, increases dopamine 2.5 times above baseline. So there's a peak that goes up above baseline 2.5 times higher. It is very short-lived. Anyone who has ever been a chain smoker or observed a chain smoker understands that the increase in dopamine from nicotine is very temporary. Cocaine will increase the level of dopamine in the bloodstream 2.5 times above baseline. Amphetamine will increase the level of dopamine 10 times in the bloodstream, a tremendous increase in dopamine. Exercise. Now, exercise will have a different impact on the levels of dopamine depending on how much somebody subjectively enjoys that exercise. So if you're somebody who loves running, chances are it's going to increase your levels of dopamine 2 times above your baseline, not unlike sex. People who dislike exercise will achieve less dopamine increase, or no increase in dopamine from exercise. And if you like other forms of exercise like yoga or weightlifting or swimming, again, it's going to vary by your subjective experience of whether or not you enjoy that activity. So for instance, the pen that I'm holding right now, I like the way it feels. I like the way it writes. I could probably get a dopamine hit just by talking about this pen. And that's not because I release dopamine more easily. It's that as we start to engage with something more and what we say about it has a profound impact on its rewarding or non-rewarding properties. Now it's not simply the case that you can lie to yourself and tell yourself you love something when you don't really love it. And it will increase dopamine. But what's been found over and over again is that if people journal about something, or they practice some form of appreciation for something, or they think of some aspect of something they enjoy, the amount of dopamine that behavior will evoke tends to go up. So for people that hate exercise, you can think about aspects of exercise that you really enjoy. However, I will caution you against saying to yourself, I hate exercise, or I hate studying, or I hate this person. But I love the reward I give myself afterward. Rewards are given afterward actually make the situation worse. They won't make you like exercise more or study more. They actually will undermine the dopamine release that would otherwise occur for that activity. There are activities that we can do that will give us healthy, sustained increases in dopamine, both the peaks when they happen, and to maintain or even increase our baseline levels of dopamine. So how do we do that? Well, in recent years, there's been a trend toward more people doing so-called cold exposure. Getting into cold showers, taking ice baths, can in fact increase our levels of dopamine. Remember this. When you do something that is very desirable or you crave something really exciting to you, what happens afterward is your baseline level of dopamine drops. These peaks in dopamine influence generally what will be circulating afterward. So if your dopamine is too low, you will not feel motivated. If your dopamine is very high, then you will feel motivated. The level of dopamine is the primary determinant of how motivated we are and how to lean into life and pursue things.